Welcome back, listeners, to Capital H, and a warm welcome to 2025. It is great to have you with us for today's episode. To enter into this new year on the highest of notes, I'm joined by my co-host, the one and only Kyle Forrest. And Kyle and I are joined by our two very dear friends, and I should add longtime researchers of all things HR and human capital, Stacia Garr and Dani Johnson. Collectively, Stacia and Dani are co-founders and principal analysts at RedThread Research, of which I'll let them tell you all about in just a minute. First, just before this past holiday season, RedThread introduced a new report detailing mega trends for 2025. There's so much there, but we will dive into a couple of these trends. And you can find a link to access the full content on this episode's Capital H podcast page on I2A. That said, let's bring in our guests. Dani and Stacia, welcome to Capital H. Take a moment, introduce yourselves to our listeners, and share a bit about what you do at RedThread.
Yeah, so I'm Dani Johnson. As you mentioned, David, I'm co-founder and principal analyst at RedThread. We have been in business for just about 7 years. Is that right, Stacia?
That's right.
Yeah, and we are longtime friends of David because we used to work with him at Deloitte. So we're a Deloitte alum as well. We focus on all the interesting parts of human capital, we like to say. That includes learning, skills, talent management, people analytics, and then all of the technology that underpins that stuff. And we absolutely love it. Stacia, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So basically everything that Dani said, worked with David and in the broader team for 8 years. And so it's really fun to get a chance to come back and share some of what we've been doing for the last few years. And before that, I was with CEB, now Gartner. So longtime researcher in this space.
Awesome. Well, Dani and Stacia, thank you again for joining us today. David and I are thrilled to have you here to kick off 2025. Let's dig in. In your 2025 Megatrends report, RedThread had identified 5 big themes, which, as David said, we're not going to cover all today. But those themes were increased geopolitical disruption, more growth and less people focus, power struggles continue, increasing population and skills, but a skills mismatch, and more AI use cases, fewer experiments. So can you maybe share a little bit to start with our listeners for how collectively RedThread, did the research and came up with these megatrends?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do is come November, we start to look out at what's happened in the year. And actually, the very first thing we do, and I don't know if everybody does this, but we go back to our old megatrends from the previous year to see what we got right and what we got wrong and what has changed over the last year. And then what we do is we really go out and we scour the various business publications, the HR publications, see what others are saying, and ultimately bring that back to the interviews and the conversations we're having. So it's kind of a massive consolidation of information and trends in what we're seeing. And then Dani and I get on a call and we hotly debate what we think are the big issues of right now. And we try to focus at really what's happening broadly. So not just like in HR, employee experience is a big deal. Yes, okay. But why? So what's happening within society, what's happening within business, and then what are the HR implications for organizations and what should they do? Not just like, hey, this is a big thing, but how might you think about this? And what are the critical questions you need to be asking yourself as you look at your plans for the coming year? So that's how we end up with these 5 trends.
It makes me think, so we obviously have our global human capital trends as well, and it sounds like it's sort of a similar process, maybe a little bit more drawn out. When I go out and talk in the world about them, I often use the metaphor of sort of currents. We've all had that experience of standing in a river or standing in the ocean, and you get pushed somewhere. It's fun to talk about predictions, but as human beings, we're not particularly good at predicting the future. So that's kind of more of an emotional activity. For this to be useful, for us to be able to help the clients we work with actually, do something useful, it's better, I think, to talk, as you all are focusing on, sort of focus on the now. Like, what are those currents? What are those things that are pushing us somewhere? And if we can give them names and we can tell stories about them, then we can not just react to them, we can figure out how to harness them, which I think is very much part and parcel, it sounds like, of what you're trying to accomplish as well. So now that we've kind of dug into this process a bit, as much as we would like to, I think I would love to hear the backstory of all 5 of those things. let's dig into a couple. And we're going to start with the one that's obviously sort of on every front page, sucking all the oxygen out of the room, which is AI. In the megatrends, you lay out that you expect there to be more use cases, but fewer experiments. Now, I'm reading that to mean maybe more focus on sort of functional, low-hanging fruit sort of value and less exploration just for exploration's sake. By reading that right, there's obvious implications there for the world of work. Maybe walk us through some of those that are specific for HR. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Stacia and I have both been seeing is exactly as you said, David, AI is growing up a little bit. And the business case for AI in an organization is becoming important, just like an investment in anything. We need to see some results. And so whereas in the last 2.5 to 3 years, lots of organizations have just been going, put it on your desktop, play with it. You need to understand what it can do. We're seeing less of that. And now much more deliberate actions taken to professionalize AI in the workplace. We've been seeing this for a while. We ran a CHRO cohort. We've done 3 or 4 meetings where we're talking specifically about how to professionalize AI and what a roadmap looks like and what investments look like and how you determine whether or not you're getting value out of it and all of those types of things, whereas in the past we did not see that.
Dani, one of the things that I agree with your statement around kind of the grow up, the professionalize is now maybe a bit more clarity for organizations on who should be the owner, right? And I think everyone's got an opinion on, especially I think this week, seeing some provocative statements out in the market. Did you see any kind of trends or even from the CHRO cohorts, good examples to share around collaboration with the ownership? Because I think what David and I have seen in some of the Deloitte research as well would indicate true ROI has to come through partnership across the functions or across the business.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest conversations we heard that sort of a hint toward that is the idea of data and the necessity of good data in order to make AI broader and work more broadly. And so AI was introduced to organizations and it was very sort of personal, right? Use this to make your work smaller or to do some of the work on your desk to get it off your desk. But as organizations think about what AI can actually do, they also realize that AI is only as good as the data that it has. And so understanding how to make sure that the data structure you have in your organization is sound and correct, or at least directionally correct, so that some of those things can happen the way that we imagine that they could happen is really key. And we started talking to CHROs, but people analytics folks are coming in and learning folks are coming in, and not just in the people space, but more broadly, operations are coming in. We're starting to actually take data really seriously because AI is going to depend on it in order to be helpful to us.
Yeah. It's definitely almost like the data folks and the analytics folks are having that increased moment in the sun because of if you were going to do something with AI and you want good output, the input has to be high quality.
Yeah, for sure.
I wonder, though, if it's as much about not just the data that we have or had and that we're using to train, but the data that we're going to collect from here forward to know in this sort of grown-up use of AI what value we're actually creating. We talked in our human capital trends last year around this notion of getting beyond productivity, that maybe in this world of work in which we're in, productivity, the traditional economist measure of inputs and outputs, of efficiencies, of are we getting more work from less people or less input or less whatever. That notion of productivity, it's useful, but maybe it's no longer sufficient to capture all the value that humans bring in work. And especially as AI starts to help those humans and we start to essentially produce more bottom line value than top line input, productivity may not be sufficient to describe that, right? To describe the invention, the creation, that sort of the potential value that comes out of the intersections of humans and machines. And one of the things we're focused on this coming year is taking that next level. How do we change the work? How do we not just drop AI in the organization and sort of incrementally hope that it's going to help you do a few more things off the side of your desk, but to actually truly change the work so that there's greater value there than the sum of the human and the machine parts. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I totally agree. I'm just wondering how long it's going to take to change the mindset in order to be able to do that. And I think, of the GDP and the way that we calculate all these big things and how we think about ahead and all of these things that are have quite a bit of momentum in organizations and in society. I am totally behind what you're talking about, David. I just don't know how quickly we're going to be able to do it.
And I think what I've noticed in terms of, I'm curious, going back to your megatrend about this year, about sort of more use cases, more grown up, that the executives that are pushing the button to implement, do they have the patience and the appetite for the sort of, I think Ethan Mallon talks about it as sort of the internal R&D that have to happen to change the work.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would argue most of them probably don't.
Yeah.
So if you combine this with our second trend, which was, I think we called it more growth, less people focus. And really what that is a calling out of the now years of efficiency that we are seeing CEOs focus on within organizations. And the thing that's kind of funny is we're saying, okay, we need to be more efficient, we need more growth, et cetera. But we also want you to experiment. And, as we all know, that those are kind of difficult things because experimentation doesn't always equal results. You're learning, it's not an efficient process. And so what I think will happen certainly in 2025 is we're going to go after the CEOs and probably HR leaders will go after some of the, quote, low-hanging fruit, one of my least favorite phrases, but the easy things that will drive efficiency. And those will be the use cases that they go hard on right now. And then I think the more sophisticated organizations will do exactly what you're talking about, David. They're going to spend time thinking about how do we actually redesign work? How do we quantify in different ways what people bring versus what the machines bring? And those are the organizations that 2, 3, 4 years from now will probably dramatically leapfrog those who are just focused on efficiency. But when you are living quarter to quarter by your financial numbers, it's hard to make that investment unless you have a long-term vision. And right now, a lot of folks don't have a long-term vision.
Yeah, Stacia, part of what I really resonates with me about what you just said is this current moment in time really requires some folks to be willing to stick with something beyond a quarter or half a year or a year, right? Whether that's because of some of the other trends you noted, like the geopolitical disruption, or whether it's the technological advances, or some of the other topics I've seen popping up tied to generations in the workforce, aging workforce, et cetera. There's no easy button right now.
No.
And it's going to require just some focus and willingness to see things through for 2 or 3 years. And the people who take that time and make that investment in a number of categories, talent, really rethinking work, et cetera, are those who, 3 or 4 years from now, we're all going to be looking at and studying and kind of doing the interviews and articles and saying, how did you do it, right? Well, their journeys are starting now.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our collectively former Deloitte colleagues, Ashley Goodall, wrote a book this past year called The Problem with Change. And if you all or if folks who are listening haven't read it, I strongly recommend reading it. And one of the things he talks about is how, we always rush after these new and shiny objects. And in the process, we often break the things that are working or break our focus on the long-term objectives. And to be clear, he's not arguing that we shouldn't change. We should change. But that we need to be thoughtful about what are we keeping our long-term intentions with, and in what ways are we making change, and how deliberate and intentional are we about it? But I think with AI, those who are deliberate and intentional right now, particularly with regard to the redesign of work, as you said, Kyle, they're the ones we're going to be studying in a few years.
Absolutely. Dani, one thing that I'd actually be interested in your quick take as well, because of the data topic as an important to AI, if I just extrapolate to data more broadly with some of your other trends, how are you seeing organizations think about sensing, using data for things like the geopolitical disruption or the other trends that you looked at? Were there kind of new and novel ways that you saw organizations just learning to leverage data and sense and inform decisions?
Yeah, I'll take that one, at least from the people analytics side. And Dani, if you have something, go ahead and jump in. But yes, so as an example, we were speaking with a people analytics leader a few weeks ago about how they're thinking about future workforce planning. And so they're using their understanding what's happening in different markets and also looking at the geopolitical risk in those markets to make decisions about where they're going to be siting future work hubs. And they call them hubs, which was interesting. So not just an office location, but kind of a group of people who are working together, maybe from home, but kind of are in a group in a particular place. They're using that data in collaboration with geopolitical data to understand where are the best places from a stability perspective, from a skills perspective, from a cost, obviously, perspective. So that's one way that we're seeing it. Other ways are certainly through things like more sophisticated analysis of latent data that exists within the system. So understanding, kind of how work habits are changing, particularly when times of stress, and using some of that to then feed into the ways that they're thinking about remote work, thinking about connectivity, and thinking about productivity. Dani, do you have any others you'd like to add?
I mean, data is becoming very important. So we're becoming more intentional about gathering it. So I completely agree with you on the latent data and trying to minimize the lift on the organization, but we're also just getting better at asking people. So when I think about the skills movement, for example, and all of the technology that exists to help organizations understand the skills that people have, which goes into the workforce development discussion you were just talking about, as well as the AI discussion that we were talking about a little bit earlier, we're just getting better at understanding the importance of data and going after it however we can get it.
Fantastic. I appreciate the insights from you both on that. Dani and Stacia, thanks. Let's hit one more mega trend during our time together today. Power struggles continuing, really because the solution to potentially this power struggle that you all found reminds me of a theme that we touched on in our 2024 Global Human Capital Trends Report, really looking at where organizations can focus on business and human outcomes together, not one or the other, kind of at the cost of one or the other. And so, Dani and Stacia, can you walk us through kind of what your mega trend around power struggles entails and the implications it has for HR?
Yeah, I'll take this one since I took it in the webinar. This is the scariest one that we talked about. And it's scary because it's pretty politically charged. Just a little bit of background that we probably all know. Many organizations have backed off on things like DEIB and equality and those types of things, given the change in the political climate, at least in the United States, and some of the backlash of the last few years. And so last year, power struggles also showed up. There was during the pandemic and shortly after, employees had a lot of power. And there was a sort of like, we're not taking any of your bowl organizations, we want to work from home, we want these things. But that's shifted again with the economy and with some of these other bigger things, that's shifted. And so a lot of the power between the employer and employee resides with the employer again. And so when we talked about this last year, our advice to HR professionals and people professionals was, do the right thing. Like, you all know what the right thing is for the individuals and the people in your organizations. Do it. It might be a little bit hard, but you should do it. And our advice has sort of changed this year because the climate continues to change. Our advice this year is much more bring all the people together and figure out something that works for everybody. So instead of pushing a particular agenda, we all have to work together to make sure that, as you mentioned, Kyle, the people are good and the organization is good and we're all working together. And so that's kind of where we stand on that one.
Yeah. And it kind of goes a little bit to the conversation earlier as well around organizations who are able to commit to something beyond a quarter, right?
Yeah.
They'll probably get trust, right? Trust between the workforce and the organization that they are in it together and they're in it together for the long haul.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And I'm usually not a pessimist, usually fairly optimistic. But in this particular case, we're not seeing a lot of that. Yep. We're seeing a lot of people sort of adjust what I would consider down to pay attention to the climate.
It's interesting though, so in this particular week, we saw the World Economic Forum just put out their latest research, basically said something like 98% of companies based in North America still have DEI programs and are still investing in them. The data would basically say it's under the radar. It may be being called different things, but it's still happening. And you have very famous cases in the last few weeks. A retailer that we would all know basically pushing back hard against activists trying to convince them not to invest in DE&I and basically saying, look, no, it's actually good for our business. It's why we are delivering the results we're delivering. So we're going to continue to do it, whether you want us to or not. I also think of a well-known CEO of a financial services firm that in their annual letter basically said, look, we'll tell you when we're doing it for altruistic reasons, but more often than not, we're doing it because it's just better for the business. Mm-hmm. That's why I think this conversation is sort of shifting is, in many ways, I kind of harken back to your first megatrend about AI growing up. I'm with you. I try not to be too pessimist in this conversation, but I think what's happening is a sort of a focus on things like DE&I and equity questions, not through a lens of is it good or bad, altruistic or selfish, but is it actually going to help our organization be more successful and achieve its outcomes?
And I agree with you. I mean, the research is pretty clear that it does, David. But two things. The first thing is you've provided some excellent case studies of where organizations are sort of digging in and saying, no, this is good for the business. And there are many others that have publicly backed off. You know what I mean? And so there seems to be a little bit of polarization with respect to that. And the other thing that keeps on hitting me in the back of my head is, I agree. If you can hold on for 5 or 6 years or even 2 or 3 years to see these things come to fruition so you have proof, it's awesome. But CEOs don't stay in place very long, and their budgets aren't necessarily tied to 5-year whatever. And stakeholders and shareholders want immediate results. And all of those things, do they actually help us make that 2 to 3 year commitment, or are they fighting against it?
One thing I'd like to offer here is one way to think about this is in the context of just what's happened, right? We went through the pandemic, and we like to, if you all remember at the time, we said that the 2008 recession was the CFO's crisis and the pandemic was the CHRO's crisis, because there was such an opportunity for the head of HR to make an impact on the people in the organization. But the implication of that also was that it was up to businesses to take care of the people. And that's really kind of the mindset that many have been in. And I think what we are seeing is a reversion or a move away from that. And again, I'm not calling it good or bad. Like, I've read enough things about, company towns to be scared of businesses being solely responsible for caring for people. But I think we're seeing a reversion from that mindset back towards, like a business's purpose primarily, at least as historically defined by our friend Milton Friedman, is to deliver value to its shareholders. And so I feel like we're just trying to find a new balance. We've got a chart in the report that's the mention of DEI in quarterly earnings calls. And while it has dramatically declined since 2020, it's still a lot higher than it was in Q1 2020. So we may just be finding a new balance.
I like that.
Dani and Stacia, first off, thank you so much for joining us today. Any final closing thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think when Stacia and I were putting this together, we stopped halfway through this and we said, well, where's the good news? And it was kind of hard to see it in the moment. But as I've reflected for the last month and a half, there is good news. There's good news about all of these things and opportunities for all of these things that I think can really take us far if we have the right mindset about them.
Yeah, one of his favorite corporate phrases is never waste a crisis, right?
Yeah.
Well, never waste a shift in the situation, right? This is, I think, to Dani's point, a real opportunity for leaders who are visionary to differentiate their companies and to set them on a path that was meaningful and will deliver better results in the long run. Just have to be willing to commit to that slightly longer vision than maybe some of the current pressures are encouraging you to do.
Love that.
Yep. And that will do for today. Dani and Stacia, always a pleasure to get a chance to have a little intellectual back and forth with you. I look forward to doing it again soon. Of course, thank you to Kyle and you listeners for joining us today as we engaged with these key megatrends shaping the world of work and how businesses can adapt. We hope you'll be back with us next time on Capital H. Be sure to like us and subscribe wherever you find us. And of course, look us up on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.